We're so excited to have a conversation about liberty, but what makes this conversation particularly engaging is your questions. So teachers, feel free to put the questions your students have in the chat, and we'll do our best to get to them today. Please make sure you tell us your first name, your grade, and the school when you ask a question. Again, we're so glad to have you join us today, and after our session, please check out PBS Learning Media to access GBH's U.S. History Collection and Civics Collection for more resources. These resources will definitely help you continue to have the conversation about liberty and other values of the American Revolution in your classrooms. Liberty is actually very complex, but an extremely important value of the American Revolution that took on different meanings for different people. Today, we're going to dive headfirst into understanding the different meanings that liberty had during the founding of our nation. So let's begin. Dr. Byles and Henry Knox, would you mind sharing with the audience a little bit about yourselves?
Sure, would you like me to go first?
Sure.
So good morning, everybody. My name is Dr. Byles. I was born in 1706, a graduate of Harvard, resident of Boston all of my life. Graduated Harvard in 1725. Spent my entire professional career as the minister, Congregationalist minister of the Hollow Street Church in Boston. And by the time the Revolution came around, I was close to 70 years old. I was actually tried twice for being a supporter of the king, a loyalist, a wiggle. In one case, that meant that I lost my job as the minister of the church because I was a loyalist, and also because of my horrible sense of humor. We'll get to my puns very soon. And that consequently, as a punishment for being a loyalist, the town of Boston imprisoned me, but actually under house arrest, where I was given a soldier that marched up and down outside my house. And since the word for a loyalist is a Tory, you may have heard that word. So I had a nickname for my soldier who was guarding me while I was under house arrest, and I called him my observatory. So that lasted, I was under house arrest for a couple of years, starting in 1777, and then I was allowed to live out the rest of my old age in Boston.
Thank you.
Wonderful, Dr. Byles. I'm Henry Knox. I was born in Boston in 1750. I was a bookseller. I owned a bookstore in Boston called the London Bookstore. I was commissioned to the Continental Army as a captain, eventually becoming a general, and then a major general, and then the first U.S. Secretary of War, before I retired to what is now Maine to live out the rest of my life until an unfortunate meal of chicken, which caused an infection in my throat. So be careful out there.
Thank you so much for sharing a little bit about yourselves. Now, Dr. Byles, you've talked about this a little bit, but I'd like to get to know a little bit more for the audience. What is the difference between a loyalist and a patriot?
So interesting. Yes. So I said, if you were to look it up in a book, and as we think about it in terms of the revolution, we think about patriot being someone who supports the revolution. And a loyalist being someone who is loyal to Britain, who wants to remain part of the British Empire, that these 13 British colonies should remain part of Britain and loyal to the king, as was at the time. I would be remiss of me not to point out something quite important, which is we use the word patriot because you guys won. Okay, in as much to say that if you look up the word patriot, as you surely know, in the dictionary, you'll find that it means someone who is loyal and committed to their country. So I just want to make it very clear, if it wasn't already, that loyalists believe what we believe because we believe it's in the best interests of our country. So if you ask me whether I was a patriot, according to the definition in the dictionary, I am certainly a patriot.
Oh, interesting.
That is interesting.
Can we dive into this a little bit more? Henry Knox, what are some of the reasons that maybe someone would have been a patriot in the sense of supporting the revolution?
Well, one of the reasons I think that there were so many what we would call today patriots in the Boston and New England area at the time is because of some of the influential people that were speaking and writing about some of the issues that were happening. Folks like Samuel Adams, were very outspoken about certain aspects of the taxes that they felt were unjust and illegal. And I think that one of the reasons that we had so many what we would call patriots today in the area is because of the sort of intense influence of some of these like very what we might call today forward thinkers who are thinking outside of the box and suggesting ideas that may have seemed tantamount to some kind of treason at the time. And I think that's why one of the reasons that Boston has that reputation of as being a town that was so sort of intense in its sort of its ideas and stuff like that. So that's like I think one of the major influences of like one of the things that sort of push those ideas forward.
So what made you so passionate about American independence?
Well, for myself, growing up, very my father sort of left town when I was a young man, and so I was kind of forced into the working world, taking on a trade at a young age. Part of it was the some of these influential ideas that I was reading about in broadsheets and in newspapers, and part of it was sort of an opportunity for something more than I had originally envisioned for my life, with eventually becoming like a captain and a general and all these things. I was able to sort of rise above a station that I probably thought I was able to rise above the station that I felt that I had been born into, going from like a bookseller to eventually having, a title and having, an estate, all these things. Although, if you would ever, read about me, you'll know that even though I did have an estate and it was very nice, I was never satisfied with the amount of money I made. I always wanted to make more money.
Oh, so hold on to that for a second. I want to come back to that. I want to know from Dr. Byles, what made you so passionate about staying with Great Britain? Because I want to see if there's any agreement between you two, or if there's only disagreement.
Well, being a loyalist is it's the reasonable, it's the sensible, it's the logical choice.
How so?
Because if we break it down, it depends on which level you'd like me to address the question, but in terms of practical things, for all that people may say that the revolution is, it's very brave and worthy and an important cause, it's also a massive jump into the unknown. So, being a loyalist involves a certain amount of a sense of stability being the most important thing, but also in terms of the other things that were going on at the time, there are questions that as someone who supports the revolution, you need to be able to answer. Because until Samuel Adams comes along and really starts to push the ideas of revolution, there are at least two very big practical questions you need to answer. One is, until now, Britain has been providing for your defense. So, if you're going to, if Britain's going to send military aid to you, suddenly, obviously, if you're going to fight a revolution, that's going to stop. And until now, Britain has been your major trading partner. So you need to think about how else you're going to make money, since your major way of making any money is going out the window.
So it seems very practical, very pragmatic.
Yes, but there's also sort of an ideological underpinning, which I think gets us maybe closer to the ideas of liberty, in as much as I think, Henry and I don't want to speak for you, but from a revolutionary point of view, liberty is a much more personal trait and value. For us loyalists, the idea would be that actually a stable government, and I'm sure we can talk about this, Lindsay, but people sometimes don't pay attention to the fact that the king was not a sovereign ruler who could just have your head off in Britain at that time. It was very much a structured constitution where Parliament was in charge and the king was already a figurehead. So actually, the Parliament, I'm sorry, I told you I was going to speak with my hands.
I like the enthusiasm.
The Parliament, with its laws, helps us to all stay safe and provides us with the liberty that is inherent to all of us. So actually, liberty becomes something that is part of society, and the best way to maintain it is through maintaining the laws and structures of society.
So for you, liberty is the security of a secure society.
Yeah, what he's talking about is anarchy.
Well, Knox, would you like to respond to that? What does liberty then mean to you?
These were some great points that Dr. Byles made. He's very eloquent. I think he's spot on about a lot of things. For
Flattery again.
Liberty, for me, I think it just, it's the idea of self-determination, and it's the idea of being able to go the way that you want to go. Although, of course, when we're talking about things like the American lead up to the War for Independence, we're talking about things on usually a much bigger scale than just personal liberty. I think, like, going back to some of the things I mentioned before, like Sam Adams was pushing these ideas that these laws and taxes that were being placed upon the colonies were infringement of the colonists' right to self-determination, and so that eventually there needed to be some kind of reckoning with this infringement on self-determination. And eventually, if things had turned out differently, maybe things could have gone differently. But, as it worked out in, April of 1775, like, things sort of broke down into gunfire and war, and, now here we are.
Henry Knox, what do you mean by self-determination? That's a really big word.
Oh, well, so
I
would say that means, like, the being able to have, like, a vision for how you want your life in the future to go, and being free to either, chase that vision, to make it happen, or at least try to make it happen.
So do the two of you have different definitions of what liberty means?
I don't know. I'm not sure if we have different definitions of what liberty means. But I can tell you that we definitely have some other differing opinions. We've had public spats before, Dr. Byles and I.
Oh,
Indeed.
We've had run-ins, and to be honest, I'm enjoying sitting with him, and it's all the old hurt feelings are going away, even just sitting next to him.
so it sounds like you have a pretty contentious public relationship. Can you share a little bit more about this?
I would love for Dr. Byles to share a little bit more about that.
I feared you were going to set me up like this.
It's gotcha journalism, Dr. Byles.
True. So, as I mentioned, I was well known for my puns. And as I said, it was part of the reason I lost my job. So bear that in mind when I tell you this. So when the Siege of Boston works in March of 1776, and it becomes under George Washington's control, Henry Knox, who has taken a prominent role up until this point in what is becoming the Revolution, rides past me, at which point I say, you sure you want me to say this?
Oh, please do. I want everyone to know.
I never saw a fatter ox in my life.
That's what the guy said. The guy said this
Which
in
was,
the 18th century.
in my defense,
We are in front of school children right now.
intended to be a pun on the word Knox.
That's right, because if you might not be aware, I was known as Knox the Ox, not only for my, terrifying will, but also because of my portly stature. I was a fat man. So this is a very cutting and clever insult. Very clever and cutting insult.
Kind of you to call it clever.
Fattest ox, I love it. So we've had these sort of, even back then, political disagreements could sometimes devolve into name calling.
Yeah.
Things haven't changed at all.
So do you think that your public personas and your public interactions helped shape kind of your differing views on liberty? Did you have differing views before you both were more in the public eye? What do you kind of think helped shape where you come at liberty very differently, one from more of a greater society perspective and one from a self-determination perspective?
I think it.
So, I'm sorry, can you repeat the question?
I'm just, because you have very different ideas of what liberty means. Do you think it just became, as you were more in the public eye and more
Yes.
talking to people through revolutionary ideas, do you think you had these ideas from the beginning and stayed with them the whole time? Did any of your public interactions change the way that you view liberty?
That's a great question. You know, as a person who is known as a very ardent patriot and was not only a figure in the American Revolution, but also like I was a very close friends with the General George Washington, who became our first U.S. president. Even before all that stuff, I'm sure that some of these conflicts with like folks like Dr. Byles or other American loyalists and Tories, I'm sure that these sort of these simple disagreements over things like taxes and policies and laws, as you start to understand how these taxes and policies and laws could personally affect you, it does make you more personally invested, more emotional, and more prone to things like getting super angry when someone calls you a name as you ride by on a horse. So I think that these policy sort of disagreements can become personal disagreements, as we've seen in our own experience.
So I think that for me, having spent my professional life pastoring in a church, first of all, I think it's worth noting that I made a point. So historically, it's true that most religious figures and leaders of churches in Boston at the time of the Revolution were staunchly in favor of the Revolution. So not only was I unusual in being a loyalist religious figure, it was also the case that I made a point of never preaching politics from the pulpit. Quite proud of that. Nonetheless, I think that my religious training and the fact that in terms of my family connections, I had come from a family that had been loyalist, that was connected to loyalists, and I think that my sense of that never really changed. I think it potentially intensified as things became more frayed and things became clearly at stake. And indeed, so most people have to sadly admit have never heard of me, but. If they ever have, there is one quote which I think summarizes a sense of how things are beginning to even change and get worse from my perspective, because you may have heard of the Boston Massacre we just celebrated, if celebration is the right word, the anniversary of the Boston Massacre on March the 5th, in this case March the 5th, 1770. And when I saw the funeral procession for the first victim of the Boston Massacre, a gentleman by the name of Crispus Attucks, I turned to a friend and I said, people may call me a brainless Tory, but I ask you, which is better, to be governed by one tyrant 3,000 miles away, tyrant as in King George, or 3,000 tyrants less than a mile away? In as much to say, what I'm looking at right now and seeing a violent mob of people following the coffin, that seems very scary to me.
Thank you for sharing that. I do want to kind of dive a little bit more into the loyalist angle in a moment, but I'd like to ask you both, to what extent do you think the revolution was about liberty?
To what extent do I think the revolution was about liberty? I would say it was very much about liberty. I think that though, for some maybe major figures, the idea of the liberty was maybe slightly different. I think for some people, the liberty was about, total freedom for the colonists to live life the way they want to live it. For others, the freedom may have been freedom from things like taxes and tariffs that would allow them to sort of to increase their own personal wealth. And for others, the freedom may have been something entirely different. So I think that the American Revolution, the American sort of revolution and casting off the chains of the British Empire, I think it was about liberty, but I think that everybody sort of has their own personal take on like what that might mean to them and what liberty means to them, and like what they want to see coming out of out of an event so monumental, like one country deciding they would no longer be subservient to another one.
So I certainly think that the revolution, a key part of that is to do with liberty. I think that it has to do with those two sort of different definitions of liberty that we're talking about. That yes, people felt that their personal rights were being harmed, and that certainly was a big reason for the revolution. From my perspective, that obviously seems quite worrying, in as much as the structures of government are going to fall apart and then it's just everybody for themselves. It's also just, I think I would say, worth bearing in mind that if you were to compare the American Revolution and how it began through ideas and arguments about what rights mean and who gets to do what and what the government is allowed to do and not do, that's a really powerful thing. But it's also very different from other independence and revolutionary movements around the world. Like, as the British government, who I will freely admit misjudged so many things along the way to independence, look at this from afar, I suspect that they would look at it and say, you guys are going to have a revolution about tea and taxes? Show me the people who are being imprisoned and are being hurt and having their actual individual rights taken away. Like, who's starving here? Who's really suffering on a very deep level? Whereas what the suffering that the revolution understood was the suffering that comes from a government that is, as they understood it, reaching beyond its power.
So, Dr. Byles, do you want to make your case for school children as to why the Loyalist cause was the right cause to support? This is your time, your chance. Clear up any misconceptions. We are so, as you mentioned earlier, we're so focused on the Patriot cause.
I think I would just want to emphasize, and hopefully it's been clear from our discussion so far today, that us Loyalists loved our country as much as anybody else, believed that this was the right thing to do, and that being a Loyalist and being part of Britain meant that you were under British rules, which already meant that the king was not in massive charge, and that, to be honest with you, Boston had an advantage of being so many thousands of miles away from London, so it was often quite left alone, honestly. And that actually, if you appreciated that stability, there are a lot of big questions you need to answer about, jumping into the unknown and what is life going to be like as an independent country, which for me is, there are way too many questions to make that feel like it's a sensible thing. And we're already getting our rights as British subjects, so I don't see any reason or any safe and logical reason to threaten that in any way. And it's worth, to finish off that thought, thinking about the fact that the reason the revolution happened, I think, and General Knox would agree with this, that the reason the revolution happened is because those big leaders of the revolution saw that they had rights that came to them because they were English, right? And because those rights were being threatened, that led to revolution, which already tells you that being a British subject gives you the rights and protections that we already have, and what they're asking for actually is taking those certainties and those rights, not necessarily taking them away, but certainly threatening them and prioritizing the individual and threatening the structures of society. And all of that seems way too dangerous to me.
Do you think liberty can endure in this new nation?
I mean, I think I've probably made it clear that the British system of government with its, you guys here nowadays have a written constitution, and in Britain they have an unwritten constitution. And I would say the reason for that being a good thing is that it's easier to fix than something that's already set down. So already saying that, the short answer to your question is yes, I think it can. Yes, I would prefer a system which doesn't write those things down and make them more difficult to protect in the long run. But if people are able to balance both their individual rights and their commitments to society, then there's no reason why liberty cannot endure in this new country.
And what about you, Knox? Do you think liberty can endure in this new nation?
I think, first of all, that was very eloquent, Doctor. You're always such a good speaker. What year were you born again?
1706.
1706.
Some people think 1707.
You're older and wiser than I am, so that was a very eloquent answer. I thought it was beautiful. I didn't know that about the unwritten constitution. I'll have to look that up.
You don't believe me?
No, I do believe you. Yeah, I have to look it up and make sure you're not spinning a yarn here.
So unlike me.
Yes, I think that liberty can endure in this new nation as long as there are people that are willing to speak out, willing to take a stand, willing to take a little risk for what they believe is right, and to also to love and support your fellow countrymen. As long as these sort of ideas are in the hearts and minds of the people, I think that liberty can endure. And I know that's a bunch of vagary, but that's how I feel.
I think this is fantastic. Thank you both so much for starting this conversation. And now it's your turn to ask questions. So I'm going to start with some questions that we've received so far. So please keep them coming into the chat. Again, if you're going to put a question into the chat, please send over your name, your grade, and the school that you're from. Callie would like to know why your hats are shaped like that.
That is a really good question. Kelly?
Callie,
that's a great question. One of the things that made these hats so popular in the 18th century was the prevalence of being in urban spaces and the powdered wig. These hats that we wear, we often today call them like tricorn hats or tricorner hats. Although I believe in the 18th century, it would have more often called a checked or a cocked hat. And it's kind of a simple farming hat, just with the sides kind of pinned up. And one of the things that made these hats so popular was that these hats, if you're in an urban space, you're oftentimes taking your hat off for various reasons, and hats like this are much easier to carry around under an arm. So that's one of the factors that made these hats so popular. Also, because you might have noticed, they also look fantastic. They look absolutely cool. I think that they're going to come back into style very soon.
I can only hope.
I won't hold my breath on that one.
You have nothing bad about the hats, Doctor?
No, not at all. You did a superb
Great
job.
question, Callie.
They're pretty awesome. Remy at St. John Paul II Catholic School wants to know how old you were at the start of the revolution, how old both of you were at the start of the revolution.
So I was born in 1750, and I was born July 25th, 1750. I was born very close to where South Station in Boston, Massachusetts is today. There is a plaque. It is now a gym, but that was where I was born. And so I was about 19 or 20 years old during when the Boston massacre shooting happened, and I would have only been about 25 years old when I was commissioned into the Army as a captain. And so I was actually the youngest general in the Continental Army.
So when you study history, one of the skills you have to develop is a sense for which information is correct and which documents are the ones you're going to believe and seem most likely to be true. I say this because there is some dispute as to whether I, Dr. Byles, was born in 1706 or 1707. Nonetheless, that means that by the time 1775 rolled around, I was certainly in my late 60s, and part of the reason that they placed me under house arrest and didn't ship me off to some other part of the world is partly because I was a popular punster and loved public figure, but also because, and I was, well known for my sermons, and people used to like me to speak at certain occasions. But nonetheless, part of the reason that I was placed under house arrest rather than having a more severe punishment is because I was already 70 or so years old in 1776. So by the time I was tried the following year, that's how I ended up staying in Boston, being that rare thing, a loyalist in Boston at the time of the Revolution.
Doc, do you have any insight on what you did during your house arrest to keep yourself entertained?
So I will tell you one little story. So my house arrest in total lasted 2 years. For 2 months, that included a guard, my observatory, as I mentioned. Remember, Tory means loyalist.
Oh, yeah.
I didn't say good sense of humor. Nonetheless, so it got to quite a ridiculous situation where I asked the sentry, the soldier who was guarding me, imagine the scene, like he's paid to pace up and down outside my house all day long. So I asked him, would he mind going to the to fetch water from the well? And inevitably, he says no, and somehow or another, I managed to convince him to say, look, I will guard myself. So you go and get the water, I'll march up and down with the gun. And that's actually how I managed to get water. Beyond that, yes, I was at home, and I actually connected to Henry Knox being a bookseller, which is how we knew each other well, because it turns out that actually my family library stretched to something like 1,800 books.
Wow.
So I could well imagine I spent most of that time thinking deeply, writing little poems, and reading from my quite massive library.
Well, thank you for sharing. Henry Knox, we have several questions for you about your service in the war. So let me try to consolidate these because there's a lot. Luca and Gus from BTU School have read about you.
Hey, Luca and Gus.
And they want to know if it's true that you like guns and cannons. On that line, Leo, in grade 5 from Port Washington, New York, wants to know, Mr. Knox, is it true you had to get a cannon out of the water?
Oh, yes, this is true. So one of the things that I'm really famous for is what they call the noble train of artillery. When the American Revolution started, there were thousands of British soldiers stationed permanently in Boston. So Boston was like this hub of British soldiers. And one of the first things that General Washington wanted to do was to free Boston from British control. And a fort in New York had been captured called Fort Ticonderoga. It's a pretty famous fort. There were 60 tons of captured British artillery there. All these British cannons are sitting up there, and General Washington wants those cannons to be brought down to Massachusetts to force British soldiers out of the city. And so I get the job of transporting all these cannons 300 miles-ish from New York down to Boston during the middle of winter. We used oxen, which Dr. Byles would have criticized their weight, I know. We also used things like wooden sleds to transport all these cannons in the middle of winter. It was, I think oftentimes when people think of serving in the military, they think of like battles and gunfire and like explosions and, drummer boys and all that exciting stuff. But when, my first big task in the Continental Army was really a logistical task. Logistics of moving these huge cannons from a place like New York all the way back down to Boston. And although it was really tough and we did have to pull cannons out of water using oxen, we did do it. We transported these cannons down to Massachusetts, and it was these cannons that helped force British soldiers out of Boston on March 17th, 1776. And that is still celebrated in the county in Massachusetts as Evacuation Day. So great questions.
There's so many fantastic questions. We're going to go real deep now. Are you ready? Liam at St. John Paul II Catholic School, who's in 5th grade, has asked, why couldn't Patriots and Loyalists coexist peacefully?
Wow, this is a great question. Well, my first instinct is like too many weight comments from the other side. Comments about my weight. That was one issue that, no, I'm just kidding. I think that I don't think it's out of the question that if things had played out differently, that there could have been some peaceful coexistence. I just think that tensions were extremely high, and that once gunfire started and people began to be injured and die, like this sort of was a point of no return. However, if things had played out a little differently, if maybe Paul Revere on his midnight ride hadn't warned the colonists and the British forces were able to confiscate weapons, it's possible that there would have been maybe a more peaceful and equitable sort of compromise between these two forces. I don't think that's, I think that is possible, but it's just not the world we live in, What do you think, Doctor?
Wonderful.
Because we're getting along pretty well.
Listen, I agree. And
It's only because I'm here. You're only forgiving because I'm here.
I really think that you're right, that under a different set of circumstances, we could have had things turn out differently. And the fact that we all are Bostonians and love our country means that we're committed to being here and trying to make it work. The way history played out and lots of different factors means that there ended up being armed conflict. And it's worth probably saying that in the population of Boston, which was about 15,000 at the time of the Revolution, 1 person in every 3 is a revolutionary, 1 person in every 3 supports the king. Right? So that's a lot of people. And in Boston's case, most of those, the rest of my family, for instance, and most of the other Loyalists go to where it's safe for them to be, which could have been a lot of places in the world, but in this case ends up being in Canada, which is actually where my children end up, for example. In as much to say that in other places, the Loyalists end up staying. So some leave and a lot stay and end up being, Americans after the Revolution. So I think that already indicates the fact that things could have ended up differently. Things that people are always going to have a disagreement. Whether it's going to turn into a war depends on lots of other things. But there is a set of circumstances, perhaps without a lot of the government reactions that you either learn about or will learn about, that maybe it would have stayed on the level of plain disagreement and not gotten any more severe than that.
Thank you. Cora from North Reading wants to know, do you know if Loyalists or Patriots ever switched their sides or beliefs?
Wow, that's a really good question. That's a really good question because, I mean, I'm sure, what's the name of the student again? Sorry?
Cora.
Cora. That's a great question. When you ask, like, did a Loyalist or a Patriot ever switch their sides? I think personally that probably definitely did happen. Although this would be like, it might have been someone, it might have been maybe their own thoughts or something. I can't really think of anyone off the top of my head who is like a really prominent and outspoken advocate for one side then switching to the other side. That may have happened, but I'm certain that there were probably lots of people who were maybe not as outspoken one way, and then sort of turned their minds, in another direction. Like, for instance, there were multiple instances in the lead up to the American Revolution where like a big event would happen, and then prominent American patriots would sort of write about it and spin it to try to convince others to join their side. Like events like the Boston Massacre, 5 people shot in Boston. It's heavily publicized. The funerals are huge events. And it's very likely that, people that may have been at that funeral or read about these things may have been influenced to sort of change their sides. Although, off the top of my head, I don't know of any super prominent, outspoken loyalists who became patriots or patriots who became loyalists.
Yeah, that is a great question. I also can't think of a specific example of someone who actively switched their thinking, but it must surely be the case that people did. And I think it comes down to what is the big reason or big reasons that you believe what you do. Because I want to make it very clear that us loyalists also don't like the taxes, also quite upset. Hopefully that quote about the tyrants, the 3,000 tyrants, shows that people are frustrated. It doesn't matter what side you're on. People don't like what the king and the parliament are doing. The difference is that we don't come to the conclusion that we should change our government because of it. So that surely must mean, and thanks again for the superb question, that some people looked at what happened and said, oh, this tax is bad enough for me to actively now become more committed to being a patriot, or they look at it and say it's not enough for that and I'm going to remain a loyalist, or vice versa.
This is great. So Henry Knox, this question is just for you. Swan Meadows, 7th grade, would like to know, do you think liberty and freedom are the same thing?
Ooh, that is a superb question.
That is a good question. Do I think liberty and freedom are the same thing? I would, I'm sure you could look up like a dictionary definition and like kind of find out. But when I personally think of these two words, I would say that when I think of liberty, it's often the way it's often used. I would think of liberty as being a freedom, freedom with freedom with civic responsibility. I would say, I guess, is what I would. When I think of liberty, I think of freedom to express yourself politically, to do things like vote, and to do things like to peacefully assemble and protest. This is what I think of when I think of liberty. And so I guess I would say I would think of like liberty as the freedom to civically participate in things like voting and peacefully assembling, to make your voices heard to a government. And I know that probably is like not the dictionary definition. That's just how old Henry Knox sort of interpret it. So great question. Thanks for asking it.
These keep coming. Mr. Hornbeck's class from Brooklyn, New York would like to know, did loyalists and patriots have differing views on slavery?
That's a really good question.
Ooh, that's a good question.
That is a good question. So there are definitely there are some very, very outspoken American patriots that are in Boston. And some of them are very anti-slavery. Some of them are abolitionists, but some of them are not only, acquiescent of slavery, some of them are taking part in the institution of American slavery. Folks like John Hancock owned enslaved people, and so they're whether a patriot or loyalist, I don't know of any sort of, if there's like one side that is more or less abolitionist off the top of my head. Do you know, Dr. Byles?
It's a superb question. Thank you. I'm not sure that I do. Forgive my lack of insight here. I have not found any evidence that I, Dr. Byles, own any enslaved people, but I can say that as far as I'm aware, my son, Mather Byles Jr., who is famous for being the minister of what is now called the Old North Church, famous because that's where the lanterns were placed at the request of Poor Revere. So on the night of the revolution, he was still the minister of that church. And he, to the best of my knowledge, actually did own an enslaved person, which is obviously evidence of the fact that I don't think we can make a separation based on commitment to the British government or commitment to the revolution as to how you think about issues of enslaving people.
Yeah. So yeah, I'm not sure if I can answer that question like with 100% knowledge, but I just think that the terrible institution of American slavery was very insidious, and it was very prevalent and common all over the United States, including the Northeast.
It's probably also what just occurs to me to say that both sides, according to there's a famous saying in politics and history, the enemy of my enemy is my friend, which led enslaved people to either side on the revolution, because one side was saying, if you fight with us, we'll give you freedom, and certainly Britain was for sure saying that. So it attracted folks according to that argument, but that argument was being made by both sides because it suited them.
Excellent question.
Thank you.
Superb question.
Thank you for that. We've gotten some more questions about your clothing, and so I'm going to take one from the EE Little School, the 5th grade classroom.
AE Little School.
Do Loyalists wear clothing that identifies them as separate from Patriots? So did Loyalists and Patriots wear different types of clothing?
In general, no. Although, so in terms of styles, it's similar. There is talk of certain colors denoting your allegiance, and that green and yellow was taken on as a particularly loyalist color. But in terms of styles of things, it's pretty much the same. But yes, there was some leaning towards certain
Green
colors.
and yellow, huh? Mm-hmm. Pretty good. Pretty good. Interesting.
But yet you're in blue. It's just, this was what was clean that you had washed for us today.
Absolutely.
Powder blue.
Powdered blue. It's beautiful. Bodie, who's in grade 4 in Marshfield, wants to know if either of you saw your families, or I guess any family, divided by differences of opinion over the war.
This is a great question. This is a great, Bodie. That's a fantastic question, and I can tell you from my own personal experience, a little bit, yes. So I was married to a woman named Lucy Flucker. She was from the Flucker family in Boston. They were actually a very prominent Loyalist family, and so after things kind of popped off during the American Revolution, Lucy actually was, she kind of had a big break from her family, and a lot of her family ended up, leaving the New England area, and very fortunately, I was there to take and inherit their large estates. So pretty good deal for me. Probably, but we can see there that she actually had a big split with her family. They were a big, prominent Loyalist family, and they just happen to have, a big house and all this great stuff. And after the American Revolution, they weren't really around anymore. So I was like, I'll take all this, or yeah.
Well, that's part of the reason people were so surprised that you turned out to be such a big fan of General Washington and in favor of the revolution.
Yeah.
Don't know where your bread is buttered, do you?
That's true. There was a little bit of moment there where people thought I might go to the other way because I was married to a prominent Loyalist.
Yes. So in my own family, it seems pretty clear that people remained Loyalist. What I can say to sort of add to the intensity of that is that I said that my own children left to go to Canada. That includes Mather Byles Jr., my son, who was the minister of the church we just mentioned. But it is also true that part of the reason that I stayed, yes, I was elderly, but also because I had 2 unmarried adult daughters whom I stayed with, and we all stayed together in the family house in Boston. Now, which is, I'm going to say a strange sentence now. After I died, they inherited the house from me and actually treated it as an enclave, a little area that was still Britain, in as much as they did not acknowledge the existence of the United States of America. They refused to pay taxes to the government and actually got into a big fight much later in their lives, because they were around until the early part of the 19th century, much later in their life, when Boston decided, hey, we want to buy your house because we want to build a big road right where it is. So they actually had a massive legal fight.
Wow.
Because my daughters, and rightly so, did not wish to acknowledge the government and were not willing to play along with their schemes for for evicting them and throwing them out of the house.
Wow.
That
I didn't
is-
know that, Dr. Byles.
That is a fantastic story. Kids Speak Homeschool says thank you, and they want to know, do you feel there is a difference in the liberties fought for wars today than the liberties fought for wars in the past?
Wow, that is a really good question. A difference in the liberties fought for today versus the liberties fought in the
past.
Over that wars are fought over. That's a good question. I think so. I mean, wars are obviously bad, except for the one we're talking about. That one's fine. The one we're talking about is good. War, obviously is not a good thing. We would obviously want to live in a world without war. So do I think there's like a difference in the liberties that people fought for then versus now? Maybe slightly, but I think that even back then, these conflicts, I think back then, people viewed in a similar way as to they do today. Some folks seem to, spoil for war and to wish it and to want it. Others want to like avoid it at all costs, and others might see war as like some kind of opportunity for some great social change and some way that they can, sort of maybe advance their own personal beliefs. So I would say that the wars that happen today and the wars that we're talking about, obviously, as an American patriot, I fully support the casting off of the chains of this guy's British Empire, no matter what the costs and what we had to do. So I would say, yeah, I think that there are similarities between these, the war we're talking about here and the maybe, I don't know, conflicts that still happen today. But I don't know if I could articulate any kind of massive differences or similarities.
That's a superb question. Thank you again for it. I think that in the case of the American Revolution, as we've kind of touched upon, for the revolutionaries, it's very much about personal liberty, and I guess you could extend that to understanding values of freedom. And I think we can see that those are still values that countries go to war over. However, a lot of the motivations that we know about in this, I mean, motivations could be so many different ones, but there isn't really, as I can tell as I think about your question, an overarching political motivation for the Revolutionary War. I mean, obviously, it is intended to change the status, and that's very political. But in terms of what's pushing people towards that, it's because of the arguments we've spoken about. And I would make the distinction, like I did before, between those individual rights and freedoms that people feel are being taken away from them, and someone from the outside looking and saying, what do you mean? I don't see anybody being imprisoned here. I don't see anybody being hurt here. I don't see that you're doing some violence, which are normally things that lead to wars. So like this war is very much about an idea, which possibly makes it the same but also different from the reasons, or at least some of the reasons that people go to war today.
These are fascinating, and I hope this brings a lot of great conversation into your classrooms. We have time for a couple more questions. Eliana from Boston Public Schools wants to know, were Loyalists and Patriots friends before the war?
Oh, great question, Eliana. I think, yeah, there are probably many cases where people found that where friendships may have become strained or ended because of differing sort of views on the burgeoning American Revolution. I'm sure that did happen. Of course, with Dr. Mather Byles and I, we never really had a real friendship before he began to publicly slander me. But I'm sure that friendships really did end because of differing views on this. And these are things that still happen today and will continue to happen in the future. You can be somebody who has something in common. You can have things in common with friends, but then have differing extreme views, differing views on some issue that might cause a friendship to become strained, or in some cases end entirely. These things happen every day.
Right. And Eliana, great question. As was true then, as is now, life is complicated. So the people have friendships with all different people for different things that keep that friendship alive. I can't give you a specific example of one that changed for me over time, but I can say that, for instance, Benjamin Franklin, good friend of mine, to the degree actually that I was actually helpful to his son, wrote him a letter of recommendation. So yeah, we were close friends. So yes, people who disagree with each other can indeed also, and still can, hopefully.
That's so nice. I didn't know you knew Franklin that well.
Yeah, we're tight.
Any other revolutionaries you were tight with?
You're not impressed enough, I think.
We did. I would have to find the name, and I apologize to. We had a question asking if either of you knew Alexander Hamilton.
Oh, Alexander Hamilton. Everybody's favorite guy. Everyone loves Hamilton. He used to work for me. He used to be a captain in the artillery when I was a general. And then he ended up basically was going to be my boss in the Washington 2nd Cabinet. And so I did the mature thing and I quit. Quit, and I moved to Maine, and I got involved in local brickmaking, and I got involved in local politics, and I threw my weight around until I choked on a chicken bone and passed away from an infection. So, everybody loves Alexander Hamilton. He's the hot guy. I can't do a show. I can't do raps. So no one cares about old Henry Knox.
I sense no bitterness.
So your feelings towards Alexander Hamilton might be stronger than your feelings towards Dr. Byles?
Oh yeah, I mean Dr. Byles, he's got that great quote, but in terms of Broadway show potential, I don't feel he shows me up. So I quite like Dr. Byles.
So maybe Loyalists and Patriots can find some common ground after all, and some civility.
Absolutely.
It has been a joy to be in your classrooms today. Thank you again for the Freedom Trail. It was such a pleasure. Dr. Mather Byles, Henry Knox, thank you so much for your service to our nation, for your thoughtful answers, and for coming into America's schools. If you have any questions, feel free to jump the last few questions in the chat, and we can try to answer them later. We hope that you join us on Wednesday for our next conversation. This time we'll be looking at equality. Again, thank you so much. It was such a pleasure. Take care, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your Civic Learning Week.
Thanks so much.